Whose permission do you need? Whose permission? Do you need your boss's permission? Do you need a recruiter's permission? Do you need your parents' permission? Whose permission do you need? And in many people's cases, not everybody's, but in a lot of people's cases, the permission that you need is first and last your own. First and last, you got to give yourself permission to try something, give yourself permission to do something with it. Because if you don't give yourself permission to do something, it doesn't actually matter if somebody else would permit you to, if they're even relevant to you needing it, right? So, example I think of here. So I've had this podcast now for nearly 2 years, and I think we were driving across the country from Atlanta to Los Angeles, and I was, for my first time, listening to podcasts. I knew I was going to be on the road for a long time. I was driving a U-Haul, towing my Honda out behind us, and listening to podcasts. I was thinking about, maybe, who gets to have a podcast? Who gave these people permission to have this podcast? Right? Do they know the right people? Do they have a whole bunch of money? Were they able to make a case to somebody who had like a radio broadcast tower or special equipment? And no, turns out not. You have a podcast because you start making a podcast, because you decide to do it. You give yourself permission to say, you know what? The only permission I need to make a podcast is me. I start recording episodes. I start uploading them online. The hosting fees are comparable to, in some cases, less than running a website. And so sometimes when I looked around, okay, who else is doing game development podcasts? A lot of the ones I'd find ended a long time ago. Sometimes after 4 episodes, 6 episodes, 8 episodes, 12 episodes. Didn't last very long. And I wondered, why did these podcasts end so soon? Did somebody else shut it down? Were they running out of money if it's an expensive thing to do? And no, it's because they didn't keep doing it. And the same thing happens for game developers all the time, where you start when you start, you quit when you quit. Sometimes giving yourself permission is not just permission to do it, it's permission to be a beginner. It's permission to do something you're not 100% sure yet how you're going to finish. It's permission to do something that's not great at first, because that's the only way to get past that point onto being more experienced at it. Give yourself permission to make some mistakes. Give yourself permission to try some things and just see. Used to think I needed to get permission, needed to convince some higher up to let us work on this thing, needed to convince someone else to let me try this thing. And then the longer I've been doing things, the more I realize that not really. You can give yourself permission to, you feel like writing a paper on a topic, you can do it. You feel like making a picture about something, you make that picture. You want to make a game, you can make a game. And again, just go back to this opening point. If you don't give yourself permission to do these things, to make the games you feel like making, to start making games, to start learning the things you haven't learned yet, then it wouldn't matter if other people would give you permission, because you're never going to ask. Or even if you gave yourself permission to ask, if for whatever reason you feel like maybe let's be fair, maybe you do feel like you want to balance your spouse's input, or you want to make sure that it's not going to interfere with your work environment, or whatever it is. Those are all fine considerations to weigh in, have a personal opinion of, but even then, it still comes back to, do you give yourself permission to still do it, knowing that you have theirs? Because if you don't, it's not going to go anywhere, it's not going to start, it's not going to happen. Make sense? So, give yourself permission to do things. The world has moved forward by people giving themselves permission to do things. This is obvious, and I want to be super clear. I think most people are going to know this. This is not about stomping on anybody else's rights. This is not about asserting your choices or decisions over anybody else's. This is about decisions over yourself and asserting those, and realizing that as an adult, as a person who lives and functions in the world, where you go and what you do and the trade-offs and things that you make and the choices that you do of how you spend your limited time here, your limited free time that you work so hard to be able to have even little pockets here and there. Your, as I put it the other day in a comment on this channel, right? Your finite number of heartbeats that you have before you don't get to do things anymore. What you do with those is up to you. And in many cases, more held back by somebody's giving themselves permission than somebody else outside of there blocking them. There's a little story here that I'm going to borrow. This is a story that's made its way in speaker circles now for decades. I think... Right, okay, so I checked the source. Jack Canfield. I want to make sure I credit where I heard the source from. I believe it was one of his writings about this stuff. He was talking about how elephants, I think Tony Robbins has said the same story several times, elephants, when they're very young, and let me be clear, by the way, I'm vegan. I'm not advocating animal abuse, circuses, all that noise. I'm not trying to push my vegan on you either. But elephants, when they're young, very small little creatures, they'll tie them with a rope to their foot to a stake in the ground, and the elephant then is too weak to get past stuff. It can't wander far from the stake because its little weak baby elephant legs aren't big enough and strong enough yet to break that rope. But what happens is, as the elephant grows older and sophisticated, matures into an adult elephant, a humongous, heavy, powerful, dangerous beast, what often happens is it still won't break that rope. They can keep just using a cheap, flimsy rope because the elephant has long ago been conditioned that it can't go anywhere, that rope dictates the boundaries of its existence, and that it never challenges that assumption because, let's be fair here, it's an animal. It never challenges that assumption that if it just made up its mind to say, you know what, can I break the rope now? It might find the answer is yes. And lots of us in our lives, and depending on how we were raised, depending on where we went to school, depending on crummy relationships or you may have been in, unfortunately may sometimes be in for some people, in which case, again, that's its own set of challenges that I can't make any sort of promise to speak to or understand. But those are things that you just make sure you're not being held up on those things that maybe even if you needed permission when you were younger and you're now on your own, you can't keep looking for a teacher's permission, a boss's permission, a mentor's permission, a parent's permission. Now the permission's on you. It's where it's got to come from. So that's it for today. Chris here. As always, look forward to playing games in the future. Thanks for joining us.